Comrades, workers, oppressed of every nation, hear me well. You have been told that your suffering is natural, that your poverty is inevitable, that the man who owns the factory deserves his palace, and you, who built it with your hands, who bled into its foundation, who surrendered your youth inside its walls, deserve your cellar. This is not nature. This is architecture, and it was designed brick by deliberate brick to keep you on your knees. I ask you today not to rise in anger alone, but to rise in understanding. For anger without theory is fire without direction, and the bourgeoisie knows this. They fear nothing more than a working class that thinks. A worker who merely suffers can be managed. A worker who understands why he suffers becomes ungovernable. Fear did not descend upon humanity from the heavens. It was not written into the biological contract of the human species as an eternal, unalterable condition. Fear, as the working class experiences it today, the fear of hunger, of homelessness, of unemployment, of destitution, is a social product. It is manufactured with the same deliberate precision as the commodities that line the shelves of the bourgeois market, and like every commodity produced under capitalism, it serves a purpose. It serves those who own the means of its production. To understand this, we must first strip away the ideological veil that the ruling class drapes over every institution, every law, every custom that sustains their dominion. They will tell you that fear is simply human nature, that competition is instinctual, that the man who trembles before his employer does so because trembling is written into the soul of man. This is a lie dressed in philosophical clothing. It is the oldest trick of every ruling class in every epoch of history, to present their particular social arrangements as eternal truths, to transform historical conditions into natural ones, and thereby to place them beyond the reach of human transformation. Marx understood this with absolute clarity. The mode of production does not merely organize the economy, it organizes consciousness itself. The ideas of the ruling class are, in every epoch, the ruling ideas. And the ruling idea of capitalism is that your precariousness is your own fault, that your fear is your own weakness, and that the system which produces both is simply the rational order of a competitive world. The worker internalizes this. He blames himself for his poverty. He mistakes his manufactured anxiety for personal failure, and in doing so, he becomes his own jailer, policing his own desires, suppressing his own ambitions, and delivering to the capitalist the most valuable thing the capitalist could ever possess. A workforce that disciplines itself. The genius of this system is not its brutality. Brute force is expensive, armies cost money, police states require maintenance, but a population conditioned to fear the consequences of resistance, that is self-sustaining, that requires no bayonet at the door when the fear has already been installed in the mind. The factory owner does not need to threaten every worker individually when the structure of the labor market does the threatening for him. The existence of unemployment is not a failure of capitalism. It is one of its core mechanisms. It is one of its core mechanisms. A man who knows that 10 others wait outside the gate for his position is a man who will not complain about his wages, his hours, or the conditions under which his body is consumed in the service of profit. This is what political economists of the bourgeois school refuse to examine. They celebrate the market as a mechanism of freedom while ignoring the violence embedded in its foundation. What freedom exists for the worker who must sell his labor or starve? What choice is presented to the man whose only alternative to exploitation is destitution? The freedom the capitalist offers the worker is the freedom of A. Man offered the choice between two chains. And yet this is presented as liberation. This is presented as the pinnacle of human social organization. The alienation Marx described in his early manuscripts speaks directly to this condition. The worker is estranged not only from the product of his labor, not only from the act of production itself, but from his own human potential. He enters the factory as a human being possessing creativity, agency, and dignity. He exits it as an extension of a machine, exhausted, diminished, and grateful for the privilege of his own diminishment. The fear that grips him is not the primal fear of a wild animal confronting danger in an open field. It is the cultivated, maintained, economically functional fear of a man who has been systematically separated from every resource that might make him independent, every relationship that might make him powerful, and every idea that might make him dangerous. Capital requires this fear the way it requires raw materials. It feeds upon insecurity. It expands through anxiety. Every crisis, every wave of unemployment, every tightening of credit and contraction of wages serves to remind the working class of their dependence, to reinforce the psychological architecture of submission, and to replenish the reservoirs of fear upon which the entire edifice of bourgeois society is constructed and continuously maintained. Ned Marx did not stumble upon the concept of the reserve army of the unemployed as an abstraction conjured in the isolation of theoretical thought. He observed it, he documented it, he traced its movements through the convulsions of industrial capitalism with the precision of a surgeon and the fury of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. What he saw was not a regrettable side effect of an otherwise functional system. What he saw was a mechanism, deliberate, structural, and indispensable to the reproduction of capital itself. In Capital, Marx describes this reserve army with unambiguous clarity. The accumulation of capital necessarily produces, in proportion to its energy and extent, a relatively redundant working population, a population of workers that is superfluous to capital's average requirements for self-expansion. This is not the language of accident. This is the language of function. The unemployed do not exist because capitalism has failed to accommodate them. They exist because capitalism requires them. Their exclusion from the productive process is itself a form of participation in it. A participation enforced upon them without their consent, and without their consent. Consider the arithmetic of power that this arrangement produces. When a worker stands before his employer to negotiate the terms of his labor, he does not stand as a free man, entering a voluntary contract between equals. He stands as a man who knows with absolute certainty that behind him stretches a line of others equally desperate, equally dispossessed, equally disparate, equally willing to accept whatever terms are offered, because the alternative is nothing at all. The employer knows this, the worker knows this, and it is precisely this shared knowledge, this asymmetry of desperation, that determines the outcome of every negotiation before a single word is spoken. This is the suppression of wages not through conspiracy whispered in boardrooms, but through the cold structural logic of a system that perpetually produces more available labor than it is willing to employ. The reserve army is the invisible hand that Adam Smith celebrated, revealed in its true function, not allocating resources with benevolent efficiency, but pressing down upon the shoulders of every employed worker with the full weight of mass unemployment, ensuring that gratitude replaces demand and endurance replaces resistance. The fluctuations of the industrial cycle make this mechanism visible to anyone willing to look without the distorting lens of bourgeois economics. During periods of expansion, capital absorbs portions of the reserve army, wages rise modestly, and the working class breathes slightly more freely. But this breathing room is precisely what triggers the next contraction. Our rising wages threaten the rate of profit. And so capital reorganizes through mechanization, through relocation, through financial manipulation. Until the reserve army is replenished, wages are suppressed once more, and the balance of terror is restored. The cycle is not chaos, it is regulation. It is the capitalism regulating itself through human suffering with the dispassionate efficiency of a thermostat. Marx identified three distinct layers within this reserve army and capital. The floating, the latent, and the stagnant each serves a specific disciplinary function. The floating population moves in and out of employment as industrial demand fluctuates, kept permanently uncertain, permanently available. The latent population exists in agriculture and pre-industrial sectors, a vast reservoir waiting to be drawn into industrial production whenever expansion demands cheap and compliant labor. The stagnant population occupies the lowest depths, irregular, precarious, surviving on the margins of the formal economy, their very existence a warning to those employed above them of what awaits any worker who demands too much or resists too openly. And beneath all three layers lies what Marx called the lowest sediment, the sphere of pauperism, those entirely broken by the system, entirely cast out, existing as the ultimate proof of what the market does to human beings when it has. No further use for them, they are not presented to the working class as victims of a violent economic order. They are presented as cautionary tales of personal failure, of insufficient discipline, of moral inadequacy. Because if the employed worker understood that the pauper was not a warning about individual weakness, but a demonstration of systemic necessity, he would not merely feel sympathy, he would feel solidarity. And solidarity is precisely what the architecture of fear is designed to permanently prevent from taking root among those whose unity would make them. There is a fiction so thoroughly embedded in the consciousness of modern society that it passes without examination, without question, and without challenge in the lecture halls of universities, in the chambers of parliaments, and in the columns of every newspaper that the bourgeoisie finances and distributes. That fiction is this: that the state stands above society, that it arbitrates between competing interests with impartial wisdom, that its laws apply equally to the man who owns 10 factories and the man who cleans them, and that its institutions exist to protect the common good rather than to administer the interests of a particular class dressed in the costume of universal welfare. This fiction is not merely incorrect, it is the ideological cornerstone upon which the entire edifice of bourgeois dominatio is constructed and continuously maintained. Marx and Engels dismantled this fiction with surgical precision in works that the ruling class has spent every subsequent decade attempting to discredit, misrepresent, and bury beneath mountains of approved scholarship. In the Communist Manifesto, the position is stated without diplomacy and without concession. The executive of the modern state is nothing but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie, not a committee for managing the affairs of the nation, not a committee for managing the affairs of humanity, a committee for managing the affairs of a class. And every institution that extends from that committee, every court, every prison, every standing army, every tax code, every property law exists in service of that fundamental administrative function. To understand this, we must trace the historical origin of the state itself, rather than accepting the mythologies that surround it. The state did not emerge because human beings are naturally inclined toward disorder and required an external authority to impose civilized conduct upon their savage impulses. This is the Hobbesian fantasy that serves bourgeois ideology with extraordinary convenience. The state emerged, as Engels demonstrated, in The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, at the precise historical moment when the development of productive forces made the accumulation of surplus possible, and when that surplus became concentrated in the hands of a particular group whose material interests diverged from those of the community at large. The state is not the solution to class conflict. It is the product of class conflict. It arose to manage that conflict in favor of those who owned property against those who did not, and every transformation it has undergone since has served to refine, not to abandon, that original function. The laws of property are the most transparent demonstration of this reality. Under capitalism, the sanctity of private property is the supreme principle of legal organization. The man who owns a factory may work his employees into exhaustion, may pay them wages insufficient to sustain human dignity, may discard them when their productivity diminishes and replace them without ceremony or compensation. And at every step the law stands beside him, not beside them. But let one of those workers, driven by hunger and desperation, take bread from a shop whose owner profits from his labor, and the full machinery of state violence descends upon him with remarkable efficiency. The law does not protect people equally. It protects property absolutely, and in protecting property absolutely, it protects the class that owns property and exposes the class that owns nothing to the permanent violence of legal dispossession. The bourgeoisie are careful to obscure this reality through the language of democracy and representation. Universal suffrage is presented as the great equalizer, the mechanism through which every citizen, regardless of his economic position, exercises equal power over the collective direction of society. But what democracy exists when the man who owns the press determines what the voter reads, when the man who finances the political party determines what the elected representative proposes, when the man who controls employment determines the economic conditions under which the worker forms his political opinions. Formal equality before the law means nothing when material inequality renders that equality a theatrical performance staged for the comfort of those who benefit from the arrangement and the pacification of those who are destroyed by it. Engels observed that the state is always the state of the most powerful, economically dominant class, which through its medium becomes the politically dominant class and thus acquires new means of holding down and exploiting the oppressed class. Note the precision of that formulation, new means of holding down. The state does not merely reflect existing class power, it amplifies it. It institutionalizes it. It wraps it in ceremony, in tradition, in legal language, in the solemn architecture of courthouse. And until the worker who enters these spaces feels not that he is confronting the organized power of his oppressor, but that he is standing before something ancient, legitimate, and beyond the reach of human. There is a particular kind of danger that the ruling class fears above all others. Not the danger of a hungry crowd gathered outside the gates of a factory, not the danger of a strike that interrupts production for a week or a month, not even the danger of organized labor demanding higher wages within the existing framework of capitalist relations. These dangers are manageable. They have been managed before through concession and repression in carefully calibrated combinations, through the timely offering of modest reforms designed to extinguish larger flames before they consume the entire structure. The danger that truly terrifies the bourgeoisie The danger against which every ideological apparatus of capitalist society is permanently mobilized is the danger of a working class that understands the nature of its own condition with theoretical clarity and historical consciousness. Suffering alone is not revolutionary. This is perhaps the most important and most consistently misunderstood truth in the entire tradition of materialist analysis. History is saturated with the suffering of the dispossessed, centuries of peasants ground into the earth by feudal. Extraction did not automatically produce revolutionary consciousness. Generations of enslaved human beings, subjected to barbarities that defy description, did not spontaneously organize into a force capable of transforming the mode of production that enslaved them. Suffering produces endurance. It produces resignation. It produces the particular psychological adaptation that allows human beings to survive conditions that should, by any rational measure, be intolerable. But suffering without understanding produces submission, dressed in the language of fate, of God's will, of natural order, exactly the ideological conclusions that serve the interests of those who engineer and maintain the conditions of that suffering. Marx understood that the transformation of suffering into revolutionary consciousness required something that the capitalist class dedicates enormous resources to preventing. It required theory. It required the worker to move from the experience of exploitation to the comprehension of exploitation, from feeling the weight of the chain to understanding the precise social, economic, and historical mechanisms by which that chain was forged, by whom it was forged, and in whose interest it is maintained. This is the journey from what Marx identified as a class in itself to a class for itself. The proletariat exists as an objective economic category from the moment capita. List relations of production come into being, but it becomes a revolutionary subject only when it develops consciousness of its own position, its own interests, and its own collective power to transform the conditions of its existence. The ideological machinery of bourgeois society exists precisely to obstruct this journey at every stage. Religion offers the suffering worker transcendence rather than transformation, promising compensation in eternity for injustices endured in time, and thereby redirecting the energy of legitimate grievance away from the social structures that produce it and toward the private cultivation of spiritual endurance. Education in bourgeois society does not teach the worker to think critically about the system that employs him. It teaches him the skills the system requires of him, disciplines his mind to accept existing arrangements as rational and inevitable, and carefully avoids every question whose honest examination might produce conclusions dangerous to the established order. The press, financed by capital and dependent upon advertising revenue generated by capital, frames every social question from within the ideological horizon of capital, presenting its particular interests as common sense and its critics as dangerous fantasists. But theory, once it penetrates the consciousness of the working class, cannot be unlearned. This is what makes it so threatening and so permanent in its revolutionary potential. A worker who has genuinely understood the concept of surplus value, who has grasped that the difference between what his labor produces and what he receives as wages is not a fair exchange, but an extraction, not a natural outcome, but a social relation that could be organized differently, cannot return to innocent ignorance of his own exploitation. The scales, once removed from his eyes, cannot be replaced, and a man who sees clearly what is being done to him, who understands not merely that he suffers, but why he suffers and who benefits from his suffering, relates to authority in a fundamentally different manner than the man who experiences his exploitation as misfortune rather than as a structured and deliberate social relation. This is why Marx insisted with such urgency upon the unity of theory and practice, upon the necessity of the workers' movement developing not merely organizational strength, but intellectual clarity about the world it sought to transform. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it, but change of the kind that produces genuine transformation rather than mere substitution of one ruling class for another requires workers who understand what they are changing, why they are changing it, and what stands in the way of that. When the worker A and the capitalist meet in the marketplace, the transaction that occurs between them is presented by bourgeois economics as a straightforward exchange of equivalents. The worker possesses labor power, the capitalist possesses capital. An agreement is reached, a wage is paid, and the political economists of the ruling class, from their comfortable chairs in their well-appointed universities, declare this exchange free, voluntary, and mutually beneficial. A transaction between two rational actors pursuing their respective interests in the open arena of the market. This description is not merely incomplete. It is a deliberate falsification of a relationship whose true character, examined without the distorting lens of bourgeois ideology, reveals itself as one of the most comprehensive forms of human domination ever institutionalized in the history of organized society. What capital purchases when it purchases labor power is not simply a quantity of physical or mental effort to be applied to the production of commodities. This is the surface appearance of the transaction, the visible layer behind which the actual exchange is concealed from casual observation and from the worker himself. What capital truly purchases is access, total, timed, and structurally enforced access to a human being for the duration of the working day. The worker does not belong to himself. His movements, redirected by another. His pace is determined by another. His attention, his energy, his creativity, his physical endurance, all of it passes under the command of the man who has purchased his labor power, and the worker's own relationship to these capacities, his own human faculties, becomes that of a stranger, observing resources that technically remain his, but functionally belong to whoever has paid for their temporary use. Marx described this condition in the economic and philosophic manuscripts with a depth of moral clarity that his later, more rigorously scientific works deliberately subordinated to structural analysis, but never abandoned. The worker becomes poorer the more wealth he produces. He becomes an ever cheaper commodity the more commodities he produces. The devaluation of the human world increases in direct relation with the increase in value of the world of things. This is not metaphor. This is the precise mathematical logic of a system in which human beings are inputs whose cost must be minimized in order to maximize the surplus extracted from their application to production. The more efficiently the worker produces, the more dispensable he becomes. The more value he generates, the less of that value he receives. He is simultaneously the source of all wealth and the last beneficiary of its distribution. But the purchase of silence is perhaps the most insidious dimension of this transaction. The wage does not merely compensate the worker for his labor. It purchases his agreement not to speak about what the labor relationship actually is. It purchases his public performance of consent. The worker who accepts his wage and returns to work tomorrow is, within the ideological framework of capitalism, demonstrating his satisfaction with the arrangement. His continued participation is read as endorsement. And this enforced performance of consent becomes the foundation upon which the entire legitimacy of the capitalist order is constructed. The worker keeps returning. Therefore, the worker must be content. Therefore, the system must be just. Therefore, those who challenge it must be motivated by envy or ideology rather than by any genuine grievance rooted in material reality. The purchase of obedience operates through mechanisms both visible and invisible. The visible mechanisms are the rules of the workplace, the hierarchies of supervision, the disciplinary procedures, the threat of dismissal that hangs over every act of resistance, however minor, but the invisible mechanisms are more powerful precisely because they operate within the consciousness of the worker himself. The man who has internalized the legitimacy of his employer's authority does not need to be watched continuously. He watches himself, he anticipates the requirements of those above him and fulfills them preemptively, not because a supervisor stands at his shoulder, but because the entire psychological architecture of his working life has trained him to understand his own value in terms of his usefulness to the productive process that employs him and to measure his own worth by the standards of those who profit from his diminishment. The surrender of human dignity is the final and most profound purchase that capital makes with every wage it pays. Dignity requires autonomy, the capacity to direct one's own activity according to one's own purposes, to recognize oneself in the products of one's labor, to experience work as the expression of human creativity rather than as its negation. Under capitalist relations of production, the worker is systematically stripped of every condition that makes dignified labor possible. He does not choose what to produce. He does not determine how to produce it. He does not own what he produces. He does not set the pace, the method, or the purpose of his own productive activity. He arrives at the factory as a human being, possessing all the capacities that distinguish humanity from mere mechanism, and he is inserted into a productive process designed to extract the maximum possible output from those capacities while returning to him the minimum necessary to ensure his survival and his return. There is a moment in the life of every oppressed class when the accumulated weight of understanding becomes heavier than the accumulated weight of suffering, and it is in that moment that history pivots. Not the history written by the victors in the language of inevitability and providence, but the real history, the history of class struggle, of contradictions ripening into rupture, of human beings collectively recognizing that the world they inhabit was constructed by human hands and can therefore be reconstructed by human hands operating with greater consciousness, greater solidarity, and greater determination than those who built the present order ever anticipated they would possess. We have traced the architecture of domination with precision today. We have seen that fear is not a natural condition, but a manufactured instrument produced and distributed by a class whose power depends upon the permanent insecurity of those it exploits. We have seen that the reserve army of the unemployed is not an unfortunate accident of economic fluctuation, but a deliberate structural mechanism designed to press wages downward and hold resistance permanently at bay. Through the disciplinary weight of mass desperation, we have seen that the state, draped in the ceremonial language of neutrality and universal justice, is nothing more than the organized violence of the propertied class institute, institutionalized into courts and constitutions and armies that respond with extraordinary efficiency whenever the foundations of bourgeois property are genuinely threatened. We have seen that suffering without understanding produces only endurance, and that the entire ideological machinery of capitalist society its schools, its press, its religions, its political theatre, exists for the singular purpose of ensuring that the worker feels his exploitation without ever comprehending it with sufficient clarity to transform his individual grievance into collective revolutionary consciousness. And we have seen that the wage, celebrated as liberation by those who pay it, is in truth the instrument through which capital purchases not merely labour, but silence, obedience, and the systematic surrender of everything that makes human life worth defending. These are not separate observations. They are components of a single, unified system of domination that reproduces itself through the coordination of economic compulsion, political authority, and ideological mystification operating simultaneously upon the same human being, the worker, who is told at every turn that his condition is natural, his suffering is personal, his powerlessness is permanent, and his imagination of an alternative world is either naive or dangerous. The bourgeoisie requires all of these mechanisms working in concert because no single one of them is sufficient alone. Economic exploitation without ideological justification produces naked grievance. Political authority without economic foundation produces unstable tyranny. Ideological domination without material enforcement produces mere philosophy, but combined, woven together into the seamless fabric of what appears to be simply the way things are, they produce a system of control so comprehensive that generations can live and die within it without ever seeing its walls, mistaking their cage for the natural horizon of human possibility. But here is what the bourgeoisie cannot manufacture, cannot purchase, and cannot permanently suppress. The truth that human beings, once they have genuinely seen the mechanisms of their own oppression, carry that knowledge with a force that no ideology can extinguish, and no repression can fully contain. Marx understood that history moves not according to the wishes of the powerful, but according to the contradictions embedded in every mode of production. Contradictions that deepen with every expansion of capital, that sharpen with every crisis, that produce within the very class capitalism most ruthlessly exploits the objective conditions for capitalism's transcendence. The proletariat is not merely capitalism's victim. It is, by virtue of its position within the relations of production, capitalism's Gravedigger, the force whose collective organization and revolutionary consciousness constitutes the only power in human history capable of completing the transition from a society organized around the accumulation of private wealth to a society organized around the full development of every human being within it. The question before the working class is therefore not whether transformation is possible. The materialist analysis of history answers that question with the full weight of historical evidence. The question is whether the working class will arrive at the consciousness, the organization, and the solidarity necessary to become the active subject of that transformation rather than its passive object. Every expansion of understanding is an act of resistance. Every conversation in which a worker explains to another worker not merely that he suffers, but why he suffers, and who profits from that suffering, is a revolutionary act conducted without banners or barricades, but with consequences more durable than any single confrontation between capital and labour. Every moment of genuine solidarity, in which the employed worker recognizes his interest as inseparable from the interest of the unemployed, the organized from the unorganized, the worker of one nation from the worker of another, is a direct assault upon the divisions that capital cultivates with the same deliberate care it applies to the suppression of wages and the maintenance of